Thank you, everyone, for coming to this session. We're going to talk through methodology, kind of some tips and tricks around Agile versus Waterfall, process, the importance of having a process, kind of why it matters, good things to include, and most of all, good questions to answer. And then some of the documentation that I think I've found personally to be the most helpful and the most useful when trying to kind of understand how an org works or explain to somebody else how an org works. So first off, big thank you to our sponsors. We wouldn't be here without them, so very grateful for them. And then to introduce myself. So I'm Emma. I'm the consulting manager at MK Partners. We're a boutique Salesforce consultancy, also have some products. I've been in the Salesforce ecosystem for just over 10 years in various different roles, which I'll talk about in a minute. In case anybody cares, I have 5 certs. I think one's retired, so maybe like 4.5. And I'm also a certified transformation coach, so I do a lot in the kind of mental health and well-being space on the side. And if anyone wants to connect, please do. So just to give you a really quick overview of kind of my Salesforce journey, sort of where I've learned some of these things to do or things not to do in most cases. I started back in 2011 as an end user at a nonprofit. We had Salesforce, but nobody really knew it. And we were very siloed with our information. I was working at the time in corporate fundraising and going out to these kind of big investment banks asking for money. I was like 26, didn't want to say boo to a goose, didn't know kind of what I was doing there. And I'd go in asking for hundreds of thousands of pounds at the time I was in London, and find that they would say things like, oh, we actually donated last week, or we did a corporate volunteering event with your corporate volunteering team and it didn't go very well. And I didn't have any of this information going in, so I felt really stupid. And that was basically why I got into Salesforce, because I was just really enthusiastic that we had a place where we could write down everything that we were doing, we could all see it, and then we could not feel stupid going into these meetings because we'd have an overview of who was doing what. From there, I moved on to being an accidental admin at another nonprofit. Kind of look back and cringe, thinking I probably didn't build that to the best design possible. I think my enthusiasm outweighed my knowledge at that point, but from there, kept learning, kept growing, and eventually moved into consulting, which I loved, because consulting, you kind of don't have to know everything. You're sort of always learning on the job, and you can just figure out so much. And then in 2019, I left London, moved to LA, got there February 2020, so really great timing. Starting my new chapter inside the house. And at that point, I was working as a project manager for a large corporate who worked in a very different way to the consultancy and the other organizations that I'd worked at previously. I found that large corporate life wasn't for me, didn't like it, didn't like all the paperwork, so I moved to MK Partners in 2022, and I'm still there and much happier and able to kind of design a methodology that works for us and for our clients. So why are we talking about this? Really, this is the entire point, right? It's to make sure that we're all on the same page. Having an agreed methodology, having an established way of working, having processes, and having documentation, fundamentally the entire point is communication. They're all a way to communicate what the expectations are, what's coming next, what you've done and why, all of that stuff. The whole point is to literally be on the same page. Oh wait, pointing at the wrong place. And you probably can't see that too well from out there, but I wanted to sort of break down methodology, process, and documentation, because I think there's a lot of overlap, and we kind of mix up methodology and process a lot, thinking that they're sort of the same. But methodology is much more that kind of how are we going to approach the problem. And I highlighted that because I think whether you're an external consultant or you're working internally as a consultant, that how you're going to approach it and how you're going to study it matters. Process, obviously the actions, the steps, the kind of telling people what comes next. And then documentation, serving as evidence, serving as a record. Up there is more focused on design, but another kind of food-based one, right? Recipes. That's how you're able to repeat something. So, starting with methodology. Agile and Waterfall. There's so much debate about it. Honestly, if you take away one thing from this talk, it's kind of don't really do either. And what I mean by that is do both. You don't have to do it perfectly. Nobody is doing it perfectly, and neither one is a complete fit for every situation. You have to adapt. There are different styles of project, different styles of clients, and they need different things. Sometimes more Agile is appropriate, sometimes more Waterfall is appropriate. And yeah, you can die on a bench thinking about it. So, the other thing with Agile is it's kind of strictly speaking not necessarily a methodology. It's more of a mindset. And again, this slide is probably not the best this size from there, but highlighted some of the things that I think are really important there, right? Is that welcome changing requirements, even late in development. Change is inevitable. Requirements shifting is inevitable. It happens on every project. And working in a more agile, iterative way and kind of being prepared for that up front means that you can adapt to it a little bit more easily and ultimately be more successful because you're expecting it. That idea there, business people and developers must work together daily. Again, breaking down silos, communication, that's a mindset you can take, and probably should take, into any area of work. Face-to-face. I don't know if that's visible, but that kind of second to last highlighted one, that the most efficient and effective method of conveying information to and within a development team is face-to-face. That's not always possible these days, right? A lot of us are working remote, or we're hybrid, or people are all over the place in different time zones. I'll come on to this later, but that's also a benefit of documentation, right? Is that you've then got a record when you can't physically be face-to-face. But I think that the bigger sort of zooming out from face-to-face, the point of it is being in constant communication, making sure that you're aligned, making sure that you're working together as one team. And again, that's a mindset that you can take into all different situations. And then finally, my favorite, because I'm lazy, simplicity, the art of maximizing the amount of work not done is essential. And that, I think, is one of the most important things and one of the kind of biggest differentiators, especially in terms of risk, of Agile and Waterfall. Waterfall. So I Google image searched for a waterfall process, right? And it came up with this. There's often a lot of kind of documentation, a lot of kind of steps, and we sort of think of it as this like big, heavy, overbearing thing. But there are certain situations in which it's absolutely more appropriate to take a more waterfall approach, right? Like if you're building a house, you can't pour the concrete for the foundation and then be like, you know what, actually, I'd like to just move it over here a little bit. There are certain things that are foundational that you have to decide up front. And I think it's the same thing with our projects, right? Within Salesforce, there are certain things that are going to be very costly and very time-consuming to rework down the line if you're trying to take too much of an iterative approach. That said, if you are going too far the other way and too waterfall, you're not going to be prepared for those changing requirements, right? Because the kind of idea is that you're deciding all of that up front, locking it down, and then building it. But if you wait until the end to test things, have users test things, kind of double check, basically, that what you're building is in line with the problem that you're trying to solve, you might get to the end and find out, oh shit, this doesn't actually meet the requirements, or this isn't what people wanted, or you might have a user come in who wasn't included somewhere earlier in the process, who blows it all up because it's not what they wanted. So yes, documentation, yes, making some decisions up front, but also kind of allowing room for things to change and anticipating that you're going to need feedback along the way, as well as that kind of end-to-end test at the end. So this is what I personally believe in and advocate, and found somewhere on the Partner Learning Camp, and I tried to find the link so I could share it, but I couldn't. So if anybody else has ever come across this, let me know where it is. But this comes from some of the Salesforce training materials, is their adaptive methodology, right? We've all heard Agile, probably, and this is sort of a version of that. It's taking the best of both worlds and adapting it to fit the situation, kind of using, common sense to a certain extent of, is this more complex? Does it need a little bit more control, a little bit more documentation? Or is this more kind of simple and something that we can kind of just start running with and then continue to build on as we go? Gives you the flexibility to be kind of pragmatic and iterative, as well as staying on top of what you're doing. So this is kind of breaking down the steps. The blue is basically more agile. It's, I think, probably what we're all used to, right? Once you go into build, you tend to work more in that sprint structure. And the green is typically a little bit more kind of drawn from waterfall. It's probably a little bit tricky to see, but that second green box in there is about architecture and design. Creating a baseline schedule and work breakdown. And I think if anything, we could actually include that in the blue as well. Because if you're taking a more iterative approach, you're also going to need to update some of that stuff as you go. Here's just another example of some of the key questions to ask and to answer at each stage. And this, to me, is kind of the real point, is that whatever you're doing, it's the questions that you're answering, and that should drive why you're doing it. Doing story points for the sake of doing story points isn't actually that useful, right? If you're doing story points so that as a team you understand how complex an issue is and who's going to work on it and what their perspective is, that's useful. It's more about the why than it is about the what. And so this is kind of our methodology that we use at MK Partners, is broken roughly into these stages. And these are kind of the questions that we're answering at each stage. What are we going to do? How are we going to do it? Why are we doing it? Then, does everybody know how to do it? Like, have you trained well enough? All of that kind of stuff really, to me, is sort of the point of agreeing this up front. Sprints, that kind of repeatable process, right? Within the adaptive framework, kind of once you move into build, rolling into more of that kind of typical plan, build, test, review. This, again, can kind of be scaled up or scaled down. It could be an afternoon. You could do all of these things, right? If it's something really small that you're building, or it could be a 2-week, 3-week cycle, kind of whatever fits the scenario. But knowing what's coming next is going to save you time, because you don't have to reinvent the wheel every time. If you have to set up regular meetings to do things like test and review, you can set those up in advance so you're not scrambling to find time on people's calendars, as and when it comes up. And you can use it for onboarding. So whenever anybody new is joining, it gives that feeling of psychological safety, which is a whole other talk, but that is the #1 predictor of success in teams, right? Knowing what's expected of you, knowing what you're supposed to do, makes you feel safer because you know kind of where the bar is and you know you can measure your progress against it. That's why having things like an agreed methodology, a repeatable process, fundamentally matter at the end of the day. Conscious of time, so I'm gonna skip ahead a little. One really key process that sounds super basic, but whether it's internal or external clients, you want to agree this up front, is what you're going to do when the inevitable changes come up. How are you going to handle it? I say swap, add, or save. You can either swap stuff in and out, you can add requirements as new scope, or you can save them for later. Agreeing that up front and building that into your process that, hey, when we review, we're going to look and decide what to do with these new things coming up, gives your client confidence because then they can trust you that they know what's going to happen. You're not just going to slap them with a change request. It also helps the team if you've got anybody more junior who maybe doesn't feel comfortable pushing back on scope, because that can be really scary when you're new and you're trying to do everything you can to make the client happy. It gives a framework and it gives a language to talk about that. And then finally, documentation. The 3 things that I think are kind of most useful in terms of documentation are process maps, an ERD, and a backlog of requirements. I'm going to talk about user stories. If you do kind of use cases or different ways of documenting requirements, that works too, but you need to have them written down so that, oops, going back to this one, if you don't know what's in scope, how do you know what's out of scope? And if you don't know how big or small it is, how are you going to be able to swap things in and out? Because you don't know what's like for like in terms of size, right? Or priority. So having the documentation gives you the ability to run these processes well. So, process maps. There's no good emoji for jazz hands, but that's what those 2 little asterisks are. I think process maps are the most underrated but valuable thing that you can do. Like, do them before your user stories, do them during your discovery, just sketch it out, little scribbly notes. Doesn't matter, but do process maps. The one on the left is UML, the one on the right is UPN. Honestly, controversial opinion, I don't think it really matters. I think as long as you and the person or people, team that you're working with understand the format that you're using, that's what matters. Again, it's a communication tool. These are so helpful. You can use them to get your user stories, right? Especially if you're kind of putting the user at the bottom on UPN or you've got your swim lanes, you have your kind of personas halfway drawn out already. You can use them for training, right? When you want to show somebody what is the process that you're going through. They're great if you have people with different language levels, right? Or people in different countries, et cetera, with kind of different nuance to written English. When you have this, it's so much easier to understand. And it gives context to the user stories because you can see what the bigger picture is of how this happens. These are also things that you can use when you're demoing. So whenever you're kind of showing what you've built that sprint, you can zoom in on the process and say, we're doing those first 4 blocks today, and I'm going to walk you through what that looks like. And you can couch it in that language. That also keeps it live. So, and what I mean by live is, you can do these at the beginning of the project, file them away and forget about them and never look at them again. I'm sure we've probably all done things like that with documentation, right? But if you actually keep them as live documents, you use them frequently, use them to drive adoption, you're going to have to keep them updated. And they'll be a lot more useful too when you get to training at the end. User stories, the building blocks. So again, user stories, you can match them to your process maps, make sure that your users kind of work across different areas. We had a project once where we showed a client a list of user stories. They'd never worked with them before. They were like, I don't get it. What is that? You did all this work, but cool, what does it mean? It wasn't until we took those user stories and mapped them onto the process map, like literally put little notes with the reference numbers, that they could understand, oh, that's what that means. These requirements are kind of as you're going through this journey. Acceptance criteria, super, super important. Get your clients to help you to write them. Make sure that they're approving them, signing off on them, because that's what they can use later to test against, right? It's in the name, acceptance criteria. Does what it says on the tin. You use them as criteria to accept if it's built. And as I mentioned before, priority and estimate fields, if you don't have those, it's really hard to compare. And then data models and entity relationship diagrams. And I'm going to speak a little bit faster just because I know we're at time. These, again, really helpful for understanding the big picture, really helpful to design up front and double check to make sure, do I have the objects, do I have the relationships that I need to get the reports and the kind of KPIs and everything else that I need out of the system to be able to track later. You can also use these in different creative ways. I had a fantastic architect colleague who would do color-coded layers over different areas to show kind of what the different functional areas were. He'd call out risks in little note bubbles of if there's an integration, and it was kind of just all kinds of different creative ways that you can use the documentation, again, so that it stays live and it's not just sort of parked in a corner. And that really is kind of the point of my talk, is you want to just use that documentation. It should fit within your process. It should be a living part of it. That process should support the methodology that you're choosing to use, and it should scale up or scale down for the size of the project that you're working on. Even from a project management perspective, if you can kind of use some of this documentation in things like status reports to show where you're up to, where you've built up to in the process, kind of how many user stories you've built, it'll just make life a lot faster and a lot easier. I worked somewhere once where we did not do that. We had to create different status documentation, status reports, slides, meetings, review meetings, et cetera, and I counted. It took up 30% of my time in a sprint, literally 24 hours out of the 80 hours in a sprint. It was bad. So yeah, reuse what you can, keep the documentation live, and don't feel that you have to be locked into one particular way of doing things. It's okay to flex it. And that's it. I think we're at 1:53, so I think we're a little tight for any questions. But if anybody has questions, please come grab me. Happy to chat through anything. Thank you.